Yeah, in the event of a fire. So anyway, I don't think there's any alarms due at any. So there we are. Also, please can you ensure that your mobile telephones are switched to silent, and councillors, can I please remind you to speak directly into the microphone and make sure that your card is pushed firmly into the console. Members of the public, I would like to say that as a committee, we understand and that the matters under consideration tonight can be emotive. However, please be respectful of those around you in the public gallery and the committee and refrain from any booing, cheering or any other form of disturbance. So, before we, we'll move on to the main items of business. The minutes, the committee, can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of January?
Agreed.
Thank you. Apologies for absence, Emma?
Yes, Chairman, we have apologies from Councillor Brian Adams.
And disclosure of interests?
None received prior to the meeting.
Questions from members of the public?
None received.
And questions from members? Legislation, Beth? Yes.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Members may be aware that on the 13th of February this year, the government released the latest housing delivery test results. Waverley achieved 85% delivery against its housing target. As a result, the council is no longer required to include a 20% buffer in its 5-year housing land supply. Instead, a 5% buffer has now been applied, and this results in the council having 5.9 years' worth of supply. On this basis, the council maintains its view that it has 5 years' worth of housing land supply, and this update is particularly material to the applications on this evening's Southern Agenda, WA 2019, 19, 23, 24 and 25. However, this update does not materially alter the conclusions in the reports. Thank you, Chairman.
So, Chairman, could I ask a question arising from that?
Yes, please.
Could Beth, I mean, I've read a number of recent appeal decisions where inspectors were of the opinion that we were well below 4 years in some cases. And obviously an a reduction in the buffer from 20 to 5 helps. But is that figure of 5.9 what one might call the unvarnished Waverley View, which does not actually coincide with the analysis which 2 recent inspectors have carried out, which seemed to me to suggest that the position was less favourable than we have been happy to put forward? It's such a big difference from what I've been reading recently. I would like an explanation.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman and Councillor. The short answer is yes. That is based on the figure that we've maintained for some time now. The difficulty we have in appeal situations is our ability to evidence that deliverability, and that has changed recently because the definition of deliverability in the NPPF has changed and the task has become somewhat harder. So, you know, it is a challenge that we face, and we are confident that we do have a 5-year housing land supply. It's just a matter of more robustly arguing that and having the evidence to back that up at appeals, particularly in the form of evidence that shows these sites that we rely on will come forward. Thank you.
Want to ask a question on it?
Very quickly, Chairman, I'd like, I'm sure other councillors would also like that in a form of an email so that we've all got the information.
I'm sure we can do that, Councillor Sherwood. I'd also like to add something to what Beth has said, and I'd like to point out that in fact we're going to have the prospect of yet another government white paper on planning is due. I'm sure that will fill everybody with excitement. Which will include, at the moment, as I understand it, one of the measures is permitted development rights upwards. Well, there we are. We'll give you more information in due course. Right, before we start tonight, I think we ought to introduce ourselves. I'm David Beeman, I'm the chairman. I represent Farnham Castle Ward. And Emma?
Oh, sorry. I'm Emma Dearsley, Democratic Services Officer.
Councillor John Rabini, and I represent Hazelmere, Crutchmere.
Good evening, members. I'm Beth Howland-Smith, the Council's Development Manager. Thank you.
Good evening, members. I'm Lewis Jones, Planning Solicitor.
Good evening, members. I'm Olivia Gorham, a Planning Officer.
Evening, members. Patrick Arthurs, Planning Officer.
Good evening, members. Chris French, Area Team Leader.
Thank you, everybody. We all know who we are. Or certainly people in the gallery. And we have a number of items tonight, none of which are subject to public speaking, so perhaps we'll start with the first one. B1, which is WA 20191492, Longdean House, Hedgehog Lane, Hazelmere. Proposal, part approval of reserve matters, appearance, layout and scale, following the outline approval of WA 20190337 for the construction of 2 dwellings in relation to Area B only. Olivier, you've got the honour of presenting the case.
Thank you, Chairman. Members will recall this reserve matters application was heard at the January committee, where the resolution was for the deferral of the application to allow for amendments to the design and materials. Amendments were submitted, so the application has been brought back before the committee for consideration. The Longdean House site is shown here on the location plan and aerial view. This reserve matters application relates to hybrid application WA 2019-0337, which granted full permission for the conversion of Longdean House itself to 1 residential dwelling, in addition to outline permission for 1 dwelling within Area D, down here, and 2 dwellings within Area B. This reserve matters application concerns Area B only and seeks approval of layout, scale and appearance. The site photos here show the view of Longdean House and the lodge from the top of the access drive into the Longdean House site. Photograph B here shows Area B, which is the subject of this application, and shows the relationship between the existing cottages within Area B and Longdean House itself. As you can see, the cottages are set down on a lower level. The proposed site plan shows the layout proposed for the 2 dwellings, each with a detached garage to the front, with the garage elevations shown here. This master plan drawing shows the proposed layout of the dwellings in relation to the main building, Longdean House, and the lodge. The photograph here also shows the relationship between the existing cottages within Area B and the main Longdean House building and the lodge here. As you can see here, the existing cottages are set down at a lower level from the main building. The proposed front and rear elevations for Unit A are shown here. As you can see, the design and materials have been amended to reflect design features of Longdean House, shown in the photograph here. It's a photograph of the west elevation. Some of the amendments to the design include ornamental features such as ornamental barge boards and chimneys, with the proposed amendment to the materials, including buff-coloured brick to the walls, in a colour to match the stone of Longdean House, in addition to stone coins around the corners and openings to reflect Longdean House. Condition 2, as set out in the agenda report, requires that materials will be submitted, samples of materials will be submitted in order to assess the quality and ensure a high quality finish. The side elevations are shown here together with a photograph of the west elevation of Longdean House. The proposed elevations again showing the design cues taken from the main building. The elevation drawings for Unit B are shown here, proposing the same design features of Unit A, which are reflective of Longdean House, with the same sympathetic materials proposed. Unit B also features a variation in the front elevation compared to Unit A. The floor plans of both detached dwellings are shown here, showing the internal layout, and that 5 bedrooms will be provided for each dwelling. These illustrative drawings show coloured versions of the front elevations for both units A and B, showing the design features and indicative materials. The matters for consideration are the impact on landscape character, impact on visual amenity, and impact on residential amenity. However, members' attention is drawn to the main matter of consideration of whether the revised design approach addresses the reasons for the deferral of the application and provides a sympathetic design to Longdean House. Officers consider that the proposed amendments provide an improved design approach representing a good design, and the application is recommended for approval. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Right. Yes. Councillor Deere.
Thank you, Chairman. The applicant seems to have taken on board a great deal of what we said and indicated both at this meeting and via the communications through the planning officers, which is great to my mind. The design picks up the cues on Longdean House, makes it far more complementary, sits better in the character of the landscape, I think. They've altered some of the detail, some of the transoms of the windows, so the relationship is even better than it was when they originally retabled their drawings, and I've got no problem with this now at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I too was one of those that objected to the red brick and all the rest of it. I know it went in keeping with the houses that were there, but this is an opportunity to actually put something that looks better in keeping with all the other buildings around it. And I too would applaud the developer for going along with what we're saying and actually getting it in design similar to the building that's already there, so it blends in rather than stands out. So as far as I'm concerned, yes, I'm all for it. Thank you.
Any other councillor wish to speak? My word. Okay. Right. Well, we move on then to the recommendation, I suppose. That subject to conditions 1 to 13, informative 1 to 11, permission be granted. Are we using the electronic voting system? Yeah, but, oh, it's agreed. Oh, gosh. Yeah, oh, gosh. It's agreed. Thank you. We move on. The next one is item B2. WA 2019-1923, 15 and 16 Pathfield, Chiddingfold, a proposal for the erection of 5 new dwellings with associated works, following demolition of 2 existing bungalows, together with provision of access road and parking to serve existing dwellings at 15 and 16 Pathfield, Chiddingfold, GU8 4QH. And Patrick Arthurs to present, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. The first of 3 applications that I'm going to present on behalf of the Housing Department. That's why the applications have been reported to the committee. The first application is 15 and 16 Pathfield in Chiddingfold. The application is for the erection of 5 dwellings with associated works following the demolition of 2 existing bungalows, together with the provision of an access road and parking to service existing dwellings. So this is the location plan. For those who know Pathfields, it's kind of where there is a cul-de-sac and then there's a little slip road that heads to a group of 5 single-storey, 6 actually single-storey bungalows at that particular point. And this is the area photograph which shows that in some detail. There isn't any existing allocated parking, as it were, within the site. The gardens have a number of mature trees, none of which are identified as being of any particular quality, with the exception of tree number T17, which is actually on the adjoining bungalow site, which is here. So the trunk is sort of dissects both garden elements to it, and you'll have seen from the report that there's a desire to retain tree number T17, but if not, then a suitable landscape solution was felt to be appropriate. In terms of the physical characteristic of the area, you'll see these are single aspects dwellings. They're I believe they're post-war. It's felt that they are coming to the end of their useful life. There's some considerable investment felt to be required in order to bring them up to a suitable standard, and that's why they've been looked at for redevelopment. This is units 1 to 4, which will be retained, and some new car parking will be provided, 5 visitor car parking spaces for these particular units. One of the constraints, and this is the rear garden of the existing bungalows as well. One of the key constraints of the area at the minute is the access road to it is actually quite tightly constrained. During the scheme, evolution was asked that road was actually widened in order to make it a more comfortable access road. I mean, it only serves those 6 units. There would be more now, but that's part of the design proposal. This is the bungalow to the west of the site, no, east of the site, sorry, and you can see the tree that this is T17. This is the tree that the tree officers asked to be identified to be retained if possible. So the proposed scheme is for 5 new dwellings. They will consist of plot 1 to 3, which will be 3 two-bedroom houses. Plot 4 and 5, which is this, will be 1-bedroom flat and 2-bedroom flat, comprising plot 5. The amendments, Chiddingfold Parish Council have asked for the scheme to be amended in order to provide amendments to plot 4 and 5 of the garden area, which has been undertaken. And also they've asked for electric vehicle charging points to be provided for the new dwellings, and for fast broadband to be provided as well as the widening of the access road, which you can see here, which has taken place. Each of the new units will have 2 parking spaces, as well as the 5 parking spaces for units 1 to 4 at the back, which they don't presently enjoy. And this is the floor plans. Sorry, these might be a little hard to read, but in essence, the houses have a self-contained sort of kitchen dining area on the ground floor, with a sitting area behind, with a downstairs loo as well, and upstairs will be a double bedroom and a bedroom that's suitable either for a double or 2 singles, and an upstairs bathroom. And again, these are the flats. All of the units comply with internal floor area standards, and each dwelling has its own self-defined external amenity space as well. And these are the proposed elevations, which show the slight change in site level across the site. And this is an illustrative view up path fields of how the units will look. So there'll be 1.5-story units with some dormers on the first floor, right across it, which is considered to be in keeping with the design aesthetic in the area. There'll be red brick with some banding details, suitable porticos, and the dormers as well. So, I mean, in terms of the determining issues, the principal development is considered acceptable. Is looking at a more intensified use on the existing land, using the existing land resource, but this is felt to be appropriate. Issues such as AONB and the landscape value, those have been looked at by the AONB officer, and no issues have been identified. The units are entirely for affordable housing, which obviously is above the required policy requirement, but very much welcomed in this area of high need. The housing mix, whilst the unit size is in terms of bedroom sizes slightly below the housing mix that's usually required, it's felt in this location in terms of what's adjoining it, it's appropriate. The design is in keeping with the surrounding area. The impacts on residential amenity to the adjoining properties is felt to be acceptable in terms of the distances from window to window, and also the level of additional overlooking from rear gardens is also considered to be acceptable given the context. Impact on trees we already touched on. There's just really that one tree, T17. The housing department have indicated they certainly will look at the retention of that tree in the root protection area plan, which has been conditioned. The tree officer will look at that in more detail as the detail evolves. If it's felt that it's either not appropriate or desirable to retain the tree because there's an issue that it may be unstable as a result, then appropriate replacement tree planting and shrub planting within the gardens will be required as part of the landscape plan. The impacts on parking and highways. The highways, the county highways have looked at the plans and looked at the, there has been a traffic stress survey undertaken as part of the application. This identified that as a result of the development that the evening peak stress would the level of evening peak traffic parking would be 56% at present time, and this will increase to 60% following the development. This is considered acceptable. The target is 85%, so it's well below that within this particular area. Other issues aren't felt to be relevant. I mean, in terms of sustainability, the applicants indicated that they will certainly be looking to make the development as sustainable as possible. Conditions in relation to 110 litres of water, electric vehicle charging points will be provided at the before occupation of each of the proposed units, and in the 5 adjoining parking spaces, the technical infrastructure will be provided to provide electric vehicle charging points in those areas, and broadband to each of the houses will be provided as well. The recommendation is to approve the scheme. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillors, Councillor James.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a pleasure, I think, to suddenly have some houses that everybody wants in a village that is incredibly expensive. I'd like to thank the officers for taking a lot of time to make sure that all the tenants, the neighbours, the parish council have all been involved. There have been numerous public showings of it all. I've only had one person who rang, and I visited them, and it has been sorted out. The dedicated parking to me is most important because none of them have got dedicated parking at the moment, and that does make a difference, so everybody can get off-road. The widening of that little access is, I mean, I've got a little tiny car and it's fine for me to go up, but anything bigger is a bit difficult. And in the evenings, as you can see, sometimes there are, although that's illustrative, there are a few vans and stuff. But I just think it's really good that we can put some council houses in a village like Chiddingfold, where you can't buy a house under, I don't know, I'm not even going to quote, and my daughter rents just down the corner because they can't afford it. And so I am fully supportive, and I just hope that we can do more in other villages equally as good. They're beautifully done, and it does enhance, because the 2 little bungalows that are coming down aren't the best. And so it will be beautiful. So I am fully behind the application. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, well, I'm also very pleased to be here to discuss affordable homes. So I entirely agree with Mrs. James there. As a strategy, I think to reconfigure estates seems to be a very good way to gain more social housing. Possibly the only way. Other ways are more tortuous, they're possible, but this is the way to go. I like the size and the form of the proposed development. It's very good indeed. One point I'd like to make, I think it's very important to have full landscaping around new properties. This has been recommended by the Parish Council, the AONB officer, and the others, and that's been accepted in the scheme, which is great. So their neighbours will then have a more accepting attitude. But overall, very pleased to be here, an excellent scheme, fully supported.
Beanie.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a few small points. One of which, the first one, with your indulgence, I'd like to speak of, isn't on this particular application as such, and that, I'm afraid, is the quality of the printing of the diagrams. If we look at page 54, this was sent to me and I can't read anything on it. An even worse one, which is not this application, on page 106, I defy anybody to look at that and tell me what it's about, because to me it's awful. If we look on the website, I do understand that we can do it, but if the officers could try a little harder to try and get something with more clarity, otherwise what is the point of being on there? Anyway, that's my beef, sorry, I will carry on. The pavement widening, I applaud. However, are we still leaving the pedestrian footpath, or is that coming off? I feel there should be some sort of safety barrier there. I don't think it was mentioned, was it?
It's been retained, the footpath's been retained.
Good, thank you. Electrical points, I see that somebody's asked for them. I understood, perhaps I'm wrong, that we put electrical points now on all applications, unless you can tell me differently. Do we not put them in all applications, so there was no request for them, it should be there automatically?
We put them in all houses. I think the requirement within the county highway standard is for 20% of flatted units, with 20% in addition that has the infrastructure capacity. That is under review, and our housing department have indicated that where car parking is not within a defined housing envelope, that they'll put in the infrastructure to ensure that, because at the moment we don't have my understanding is we don't have a contract in place with a provider for those electric vehicle charging points, which aren't within a defined residential unit. So we can't require it at the moment, but we can certainly require the infrastructure going forward, and that will be in place very soon. That's my understanding.
Thank you very much. I do welcome that. And my final one, we've recently had a presentation here from a housing corporation about the energy efficient and all the rest of it housing that's being built at Godalming. Does this come up to that sort of standard, or are we building it in a different way?
These are not carbon neutral houses, although they, in terms of a fabric first approach, which is where we would like all developments to go, they will certainly have a fabric first and will meet increasingly stringent building control regulations, and other areas such as restricting water use, etc. They will have more energy efficient. I'm looking at our housing lead here, and energy efficient lighting in place as well. And my understanding is the housing team are building that within their specification as they go out to contractors. But that is a process that is evolving. But it's very clearly the ambition of the Housing Department in association with the Council's stated ambition for a climate emergency to move towards a carbon neutral housing type as quickly as possible.
Thank you. I'm very much in favour, as Councillor James said, of these buildings, and I'm not objecting to it, I'm just raising a few issues that, thank you, Officer, we can perhaps take forward in future.
Thank you very much. Councillor Ashwood.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Totally agree with what Councillor Anna James said just a short time ago. Just a couple of points. I'd like to thank the officers for a presentation and a report that is very clear. And when I look at some of the conditions, I mean, condition number 6, I, says no HGV movement on the site during basically school arrival and departure time. So a great deal of thought's been put into this application, and the report clearly shows that. One other point, the indicative street scenes that we've got in the various reports here, I would like to ask the officers if we could always have this indicative street scene on all applications that come before committees. I mean, when you look at some of these, you think, well, why can't we do a bit more of this and maybe take some of the older properties down and do it that way, because the new street scene really does look good. I thank the officers for report. Thank you very much.
Whilst I think you're absolutely right, I think the illustrative street scenes are fantastic in terms of giving an informed impression of what they will look like. I think whilst planning officers won't have the absolute power to ask applicants to do it, we will certainly ask applicants going forward, because I do think that they are really helpful. Whether or not we can get them for all schemes, we don't know, but we'll certainly ask. So I think it's a good point.
Councillor Deere.
Thank you, Chairman. I think this is a great bit of land use planning. Clearly there are policy compromises to be made, ALG, AONB, AGLV, but I'm pleased that a pragmatic approach has been taken to that in this case, and I think that's justifiable, and I hope the principle of that pragmatic approach is borne in mind when we come to consider other applications. I think the density is about as high as it could possibly be, but I don't think it's excessive. So that's the far end of the fine balancing act that the folks have managed to achieve. As a personal comment, I loathe hipped gables. It makes buildings look round-shouldered to my mind and rather less attractive than they could be, but that's a personal preference that somebody might care to bear in mind if they were doing any more drawings in the future. But no, I'm fully in favour of this, and I think it's a great thing, and I congratulate those involved in producing the project to the state it's got so far. Thank you.
Does the councillor wish to speak? Right, okay. We'll move on to, I think we don't need electronic voting. We can move on to the recommendation. Is that subject to conditions 1 to 18 and information 1 to 11, permission be granted? Those in favour? Just raise. Agreed. Agreed. Unanimous. Okay. Thank you very much. We move on. Next one.
Thank you, Chair.
WA 2019, 1925, 16A and 16B, Pathfield, Chiddingfold, erection of 6 new dwellings with associated works following demolition of 2 existing bungalows and garages, together with provision of additional parking access spaces to serve existing dwellings at 16A and 16B, Pathfield, Chiddingfold, GU8 84QH. And guess what? Patrick.
So this is 16A and 16B Pathfield. So it's literally, I mean, this is the previous application site, so it's literally in the opposite side of the road. The site as presently configured consists of 2 sort of attached bungalows. They have quite sizable rear gardens. And to the west of these is a block of garages and a sort of an access road for this group of bungalows. These are some images of the bungalows. Again, one of the bungalows is vacant at the present time. The other one it has a tenant in it. This is the group of garage buildings. My understanding is the garages at present of the 14, only 3 are in active use. And those are in active use under a license. So when, if this was to be approved, then obviously the occupants of that would be given notice within that license arrangement. And this is the rear of the gardens. These are the properties to the rear of that, the name of which I've temporarily forgotten. I think they're Broomfield, aren't they? And this is the view of the rear elevations. This is the garage block here. These are the gardens along these little bungalows that back onto the garage block at that point, and this is the internal courtyard of it. In terms of the proposed development coming forward, this will consist of plot 1 and 2, which is one bedroom units. Then plot 3 to 6 are going to be 2-bedroom, 4-person units. In addition, to take account of the loss of the garage block, there will be 20 additional parking spaces laid out for the residents within the Pathfield Close that they don't presently enjoy. In terms of the Parish Council comments, they asked for the garden unit of number 3 and 4 to be realigned in order to have more direct access to the rear of unit 3, which has taken place. They've also asked for the dining areas in terms of the internal layout, which is this, to have where is it? Oh yeah, there, sorry. The dining room windows to have windows which have been put in, and again, they've asked for electric vehicle charging points, etc., which have been provided. Each of the units have 2 off-street car parking spaces, sizable gardens at that area as well. Again, the architecture of the proposed buildings is red brick, red clay tile, some dormers and parts in the flatted areas, and then the other ones are true 2 stories using the land lie. Again, the internal layout of these are very similar to the ones that we've seen in the other path fields. And this is the illustrative view which sees this transition from the 2-story going up to the single-story bungalow, but there's no real massive change in height or proportion at that point. And this is the layout of the residence parking as well. So very similar issues have been taken into account in the determination factors, the principle of development, intensification of use. I think the key issues that were slightly not in compliance was in relation to residential amenity. So the back-to-back distances that we would ordinarily typically take into account are 21 metres. At this particular junction, it's 17 metres, and those overlook the gardens of I think it's Broomfield behind. I mean, we've only received 1 letter of objection in relation to the proposed development, and that was from one of the residents within these, and it didn't relate to the fact of overlooking. It related to the fact that could the hedgerow at this particular point be retained in order to protect the privacy of that particular unit? And in speaking with the applicant, they are happy to look at the retention of the hedge and to look at within the landscape framework, which is to be a condition to have additional tree planting at that particular edge to soften that view. So whilst the 17 metres is below the 21 metre guidance, the guidance is there as guidance, it's felt that because the windows aren't directly window to window, they're actually at an angle from these, that the degree of overlooking would be considered to be acceptable. The degree of overlooking in St Mary's Cottage would also be considered to be acceptable, as this is the rear end of the garden and there are quite considerable mature trees at this particular point. In terms of trees on the site, there's nothing of particular note, but there would be some biodiversity enhancement through the landscaping condition for the gardens, the impact on parking and highways. Again, the evening parking stress looked at a 50% on-street car parking increasing to 60%. There would be the decrease of 14 garages, but none of those garages, as we can see, 3 of those are actually in active use. And the 20 on-street car parking spaces were felt to be suitable and actually an improvement on the existing position at this particular point. So overall, and on planning balance, it's felt that the provision of the additional units coming forward, all for affordable housing, in terms of these are a net gain of 4 dwellings, to replace the 2 that would be lost, would overcome any planning compromise, shall we say, and that was considered acceptable in the planning balance consideration. So the recommendation is for approval. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillors?
Thank you, Chairman. As before, I'm fully in support of the application. The extra 4 houses, some people might say, oh, it's a shame to knock down 2, but they're 2 bungalows, and in order to get the better layout, as fellow councillor said earlier, it's important to get it right first time, and I think this is right first time. And the usage of garages, literally derelict garages really, can only enhance the area. So, again, I've got absolutely no problems at all. And dedicated parking is the key to all the complaints that one ever gets on street parking in front of somebody else's driveway, up on the curb, if it's there. So this actually is so good that I couldn't possibly say no to it. I mean, it's wonderful to be able to say we're building some council houses for the first time. And I'm sorry about the hip roof, but when you go from a two-storey to a bungalow, it's usually quite good to slightly... I'm not an architect, but that's the reason for it. And I'm sure at some time, you know, all the little bungalows that are getting there will have a really lovely estate at Pathfield. Thank you, Chair.
Mr Molyneux.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I agree this is certainly a good proposal. I do feel I should comment on 10.5 impact on residential amenity, where the arguments for not letting the lack of 21 metres distance be a matter of objection. I do feel the arguments put there are a little bit self-serving. The angles, the windows, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. But what I was concerned to know was that, very correctly, some more tree planting will be required at the site edge to reduce overlooking. Am I right that condition 18 is the one that's being referred to there? It's the only one I could find which does refer to planting. And I wonder if it could be made clearer that preventing overlooking is a purpose of that condition. It doesn't seem to be there on the face of it. Perhaps Patrick could comment.
No, we haven't specifically said that the nature of the landscape would be specifically for overlooking, but I think it's within the reference. It's referenced within the report. We can include that to make that absolutely clear, and I think the applicant is pretty clear on what the nature of the requirement is. So yeah, I can have a look at that and tighten that up if you feel that is appropriate.
I think the fact that we happen to know the applicant rather well should not blind us to the fact in other applications we might have the same concerns. And I think it would be better if you are going to mention overlooking prevention as the purpose of one of the conditions, then yes, you should be clearer in the condition that is going to be required. After all, you might get a different officer looking at it and they might forget. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. I really would just like to support everything that Mrs James and other councillors are saying, that it is so welcoming to see council housing appear on our planning committees, because it's something that we've been talking about for a long time that is desperately needed. And I would like to say that the design and layout I feel is excellent, it's so nice to see. And also the parking, as Mrs James said, parking is one of the most unneighbourly things that happens. Everybody complains and they shout at each other, but this makes it so welcoming, and I just would like to congratulate the officers.
Thank you, Chairman. A very minor thing. If we look at condition 6, it talks about HGV movements. Very good, excellent. But it doesn't actually say any days. It just says the hours of 8 and 8:45 and 3 to 3:45. Look at the previous condition about construction, etc. It talks about nothing on Saturday afternoon and Sunday. Could we tie Saturday and Sunday into the other condition? Would that be, please? That's condition 6.
Patrick, is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay. Wish to speak? Okay. Right. Obviously, there are a couple of amendments to the conditions, Patrick. But I don't know whether you want to do that separately outside and give the members concerned details of what you're going to propose as revisions. We can do that by. I mean, if the councillors are accepting that they do it by email to you, or do you want to do it now?
I'm content that it's been taken on board. I think the lesson is for future applications to be clearer in the condition in the first place.
Okay, I just wanted to clear that. And
Just to be clear, I think in condition 18 in relation to screening, I think it's appropriate to put the screening reason within the reason rather than necessarily within the condition, if you would consider that acceptable, Councillor Mulliner. To the construction, I just revise that and put in condition 6 in the wording of condition 6 within the previous application 1923, if that would be considered acceptable.
yeah, right, anybody else wish to speak? Okay, we'll move to the recommendation. That's subject to conditions 1 to 21, and I'll say as revised in certain cases, and in forms 1 to 14, permission be granted. Those in favour? Right. Okay, we move on to the final item, which is WA 2019-1924, 57 and 59 Hartsgrove, Chiddingfold, a proposal that erection of 5 new dwellings with associated works following demolition of 2 existing dwellings and garages at 57 and 59 Hartsgrove, Chiddingfold, GU84RG. And Patrick, yet again.
Sorry. Location plan. So those that may know the site, Hartsgrove is sort of, you come in here and then it's a one-way system around. The site itself is in the northeast corner of the site. Hold on. This hasn't. Sorry, this is it here. I don't know. It got slightly confused. So this is the location plan. The yellow is 2-story attached dwellings. The site consists of 2 of these and a group of garages at the rear of this. I think there are 10 garages at the moment, and a row of single-story bungalows, which is to the north of Hartsgrove as well. You can see here, one of the key considerations is this whole area to the east is ancient woodland, and then there's open countryside further to the north. So the properties themselves in Hartsgrove, these are the 2 properties. My understanding from the applicant is that these require quite considerable investment at this present time. And therefore they took the opportunity to look at this and look at the site and the adjoining garage block. This is the garage block at the present time. As you can see, they are rather unloved. And my understanding is that 2 of the 10 are presently in use. To the east of the site, there is this single-story bungalow. There is a side window here and here. My understanding is this, I think, this looks like a bedroom window. I can't absolutely clarify that, but that's my understanding. And this is a kitchen window. And they also have retained access to their garage at this particular point. So those are some of the site considerations and constraints. In relation to the development that has come forward, this is configured of plots 1 and 2. These are slightly larger 3-bedroom, 5-person units with their own rear garden amenity spaces. And plots 3 to 5, and these consist of 2-bedroom, 4-person units. Chiddingfold Parish Council have looked at the initial submission and requested that Unit 5 had a hall landing window inserted at this point, which has duly taken place with an amended plan, and that the hall doors and the front elevations had larger glazing in order to make those more pleasant for future occupiers, which has also taken place. And also the requested electric vehicle charging points, which are also taking place. So again, the plot elevations, these are sort of a buff brick with red brick banding, with quite large porches for plot 1 and 2, and plot 3 and 4, with dormers at that point. Plot 5, it got actually amended following the submission to remove the dormer window at this particular point in order to avoid overlooking of this particular bungalow, because the overlooking would be there. The bedroom window was placed on this elevation, so they're looking over this section of the garden beyond the garage block, which is felt to be more appropriate and reduces the impact on that bungalow and the occupier. So again, these are some street elevations and sections of the buildings which sit relatively comfortable within the site. Again, this rear building, this dormer has been removed and some veluxes put in here. But again, the buildings are set back, so again, they turn that corner relatively successfully, and the ancient woodland is beyond. Again, all of the units have 2 allocated car parking spaces, which is policy compliant. And again, so these are the key issues. Again, the principal development and intensification and use of this valuable land resource is considered acceptable. Surrey Hill's outstanding natural beauty. The OMB officer has commented on it and set out a number of recommendations by condition, which have been taken into account. The housing mix is felt to be acceptable. It was good to see some 3-bedroom units in this particular development. All of them being affordable is obviously a great advantage. The design is considered appropriate. The impact on residential amenity of the adjoining neighbours is considered acceptable, especially after the dormer has been replaced. The impact on trees on the site, there aren't really any mature trees on the site, but obviously the ancient woodland beyond the development, there is obviously built development on the site already, so the issue of encroachment within that buffer zone is considered acceptable. However, Surrey Wildlife Trust did look at the application in some detail and set out conditions, which include there are some bats found on the site, but the additional inspection is required prior to demolition. They need a license on to take that work, mitigation in terms of bat roost, boxes and bricks to be replaced as a mitigation measure, as is control of external lighting on the properties in order to protect the ancient woodland. In terms of parking and highways, the applicant undertook a car parking stress survey as part of the submission. This identified an increase in parking stress at peak evening going from 66% to 78%, which again is below the 85% threshold, which is typically recognised. County highways have looked at this and again haven't identified any issues. One of the issues was that the nature of the one-way system wasn't properly signposted. Again, this isn't an issue for the applicant per se, but this has certainly been highlighted and will be looked into and addressed, irrespective of what happens to this application and its outcome. So again, I think the recommendation, as you will see, is for a recommendation for approval, and as the application is felt to be acceptable and on planning balance, the benefits of having a 100% affordable housing scheme outweigh any impacts that are identified. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillors? Yes, Councillor Deere.
Thank you, Chairman. Hopefully we're not going to all repeat what we've said about the wonderful design and everything, because these seem to be very similar to the other 2 sites, and I think we've all covered that quite carefully. I mean, clearly there are still policy compromises, but that's fine. I think that's appropriate. And I was particularly pleased to see the provision in respect of the dealing with the bats on the site. It's not a question of paralysing the whole scheme, but implementing a scheme of working around to protect and preserve, but without sterilising the development for that particular reason. And I hope that's borne in mind also in dealing with other applications that the Borough has to consider. Thanks very much, Chairman.
Councillor James.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure it'll be perfect because we know the applicants well. The officers of the applicant of Waverley will have to make sure it's good. And if not, I'm sure I'll be called on the telephone The parish council will be there making sure it's good. And so in order to make sure we can do it everywhere within Waverley, this is an example of how we should do it. It's consultation. The few objections that have come via the parish council, the applicant has taken on board. If only other applicants would take that on board, we would have wonderful unanimous decisions. So the housing department need to be absolutely congratulated with the officers. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Councillor Beanie.
Hey, Chairman, a couple of minor things. First of all, again on condition 6, if we could add the HGV lack of movement on Saturday and Sundays. The other thing is under condition 13, it talks of a pond. I'm not sure I saw on any plan. Is there a pond there somewhere? Does it overlap neighbours or is it in a single house? Who would be in control? Because you talk about it, it has to be done by hand and under ecological supervision. But if it's 2 people, I'm not quite sure because I can't see it on the plan anyway.
I don't think there's a pond. It might be a large puddle.
Condition 13 says if the pond is to be removed.
Yeah.
Or have I got the wrong?
I think that was my mistake. I don't know where that pond came from. Sorry.
Chairman. Sorry.
No, I think condition 13 is to be removed.
I don't think there's a pond. It might be a large puddle by the garages, but you know, I think it's probably. I haven't seen a pond up there. You know, I mean, it's beautiful land up there, and get rid of the garages and make. You know, I don't mind, but I don't think there's a pond. Sorry.
So I think I don't know what I did. Apologies.
Do you wish to speak? Okay. Right, any other councillor wish to speak? Shall we move to the recommendation? Well, this is going to be I'm going to say subject to conditions 1 to 12 and 14 to 20. And informers 1 to 14, permission be granted. Those in favour? Right, I don't think there's any legal advice to consider, Lewis?
No, Chairman.
No. On the, first of all, I'd like to thank the comments that have been made from Chinningford. I think I'm unable to speak publicly, but thank you for the comments, and we have tried to take them all on board, sir and madam, ladies from Chinningford. Anyway, there we are. That's the end of tonight's meeting. Thank you very much. Good night. items are considered tonight can be emotive. However, please be respectful of those around you in the public gallery and the committee and refrain from any booing, cheering or any other form of disturbance. Anyway, we'll move on now to the items on the agenda. Minutes. Can you confirm the minutes of the meeting on the 21st of January, please? Agreed? Yeah, well, I mean, you know, they are available out the back somewhere. But if you want to see them, I won't sign until you've seen them. Emma?
Yes, I have apologies from Councillor George Hess.
Okay. What's your interest, Emma?
I believe that you have an interest that you're going to read out.
Yeah, I have two interests, actually. I would like to say I am a member of the Found Society. I was a member of the Western Planning Committee, but I resigned from that position some time ago, and that I have played no part in any discussions or any meetings, in fact, effectively since that date. I'm also a member of Farnham Town Council's Planning and Licensing Consultative Working Group that was responsible for forming an opinion that the Town Council should object to this planning application. To be quite honest with you, I've missed several meetings and I don't actually recall debating this particular application, but I am declaring of a non-pecuniary interest of sufficient weight, since I'm chairman of this committee, that I shall withdraw from the meeting as there may be a perception, and it would be a perception that I've already made up my mind, although I can't recall it. Anyway, I shall be withdrawing from the committee at that stage. Are there any other council? Yes,
Good evening, Chair. Thank you. Yes, I want to declare that I am the leader of Farnham Town Council and also a member of its consultative committee on planning. So I have seen the application that's in front of us tonight. I'm not predetermined on this. I'm interested to see what comes out in this meeting, and I will, make a decision on that. So I will stay in the meeting. Thank you.
Any other councillors wish to make any declarations? No. Yes, Ward.
Not actually a declaration of interest. You got rather ahead of me. I also bring apologies from Councillor Michaela Gray, who is unfortunately detained.
Okay, right. I shall leave you in a short while. Questions from members of the public?
Number 3, Chairman.
Questions? Relevant legislation, Beth, that we should be aware of?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Members may be aware that on the 13th of February 2020, the government released the latest housing delivery test results. Waverley achieved 85% delivery against its housing target. As a result, the council is no longer required to include a 20% buffer in its 5-year housing land supply. Instead, a 5% buffer has now been applied, and this results in the council having 5.9 years worth of supply. On this basis, the council maintains its view that it has 5 years worth of housing land supply. This update is material to application WA 2019-1706 on tonight's Western agenda. It does not, however, materially impact upon the conclusions of the report. Thank you, Chairman.
I think at the last meeting we agreed to give all the councillors a copy of this, so we'll give all Western members a copy as well. Okay? Right. Right. The only thing I would ask to actually add on the legislation is that we are now expecting a new planning white paper. Hurrah, hurrah. And that will include some changes which we believe will include permitted development upwards. But we'll give you further details when we know them themselves. Anyway, I shall now leave.
Right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. For members of the public, I'm Councillor John Rabini. I represent Hazelmere, and I'm the Vice Chairman tonight. I have no pecuniary advantage, so I will be remaining and taking the meeting. Thank you. Officers, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourselves, please. Should we start at the front?
Patrick Arthurs, Planning Officer.
Good evening, members. Chris French, Area Team Leader.
Chris Turner, Planning Officer.
Good evening, members. I'm Lewis Jones, a Planning Solicitor.
Good evening, members. Beth Howland-Smith, Development Manager.
Emma Dearsley, Democratic Services Officer.
Right, thank you. We only have one item tonight, which is the A1, item 7.2, WA 20191706, Springfield, 30 Frensham Vale, Lower Bourne. If I could ask the officer, Chris Turner, to introduce, please.
Thank you, Chair. The application is for the erection of a dwelling with associated drive and parking, and is a revision of a previous application. The site is located on the northwestern side of Frensham Vale. It currently comprises a large two-storey detached property located centrally within the plot. The proposal would be located north-east of the host dwelling. It would be accessed via a driveway, which would be attached to an existing driveway. The proposed dwelling would be 2 stories in height, featuring two gables on the front and rear. The application is a resubmission of previous application. The next 2 slides demonstrate the difference between the 2 applications. I'd like to draw members' attention to this, to the driveway where it, to this part of the scheme here, which is the primary difference between the 2. On the previous application, part of the access was located within flood zone 3. The applicant has amended the design of the scheme, so this was the previous application, to take it out of flood zone 3. This drawing is taken from their flood risk assessment, demonstrating where that difference is. I would like to draw Council's attention to the fact that at this stage, the built form of the application, being the house itself and the amenity space, is all within flood zone 1. This plan again demonstrates the difference between the 2 applications. The green area is the proposed application, we see it tonight, and there's a faint red line where it was previously proposed. In the absence of a committee site visit, and I thank those members which did show up, regardless, knowing the fact that they couldn't get onto site, I've put together a collection of photographs to try and give the committee a feel of how the site is. Photograph 1 in the top left shows from within the site looking out to Frensham Vale. Photograph 2 looks straight ahead onto the site. Photograph 3 looks towards the southwest towards Frensham Lodge, and photograph 4 looks to the northeast. Photograph 5 looks directly towards the host dwelling. Photograph 6 is looking towards a host dwelling in a northwesterly direction, stood further along the driveway. Photograph 7 is looking northeast towards where the proposed driveway joins the existing driveway. And photograph 8 is again looking northwest to show where the access joins the existing driveway. This isn't the finished driveway. The driveway is set to be, or would be, amended following a grant of permission. Photograph 9 is looking north towards the proposal site, up where the proposed driveway is. There's been some minor cutting of the land to show where that driveway would be. Photograph 10 shows the site itself looking north towards the woodland, and photograph 11 is looking slightly to the west of that. Photograph 12 and photograph 13 are looking south towards Frensham Vale. On photograph 12, you can just see the roof slope of number 28 Frensham Vale in the distance, and on number 13 on the left-hand side of the photograph is the host dwelling. At the request of the councillors on site, I provide a summary of the difference in flood zones across the site. These are shown on the flood risk maps. These are generated from modelled data and according to the EARA best estimate of flood risk in a particular area. I draw your attention now to the Environment Agency's comments on the application itself. They raised no objection to the scheme, but they do provide us with two important pieces of information. Firstly, they note that the access route within the red line boundary is above the 1 in 100 year plus 70% climate change extent, and therefore outside of flood zone 3. They then go on to point out that safe access and egress is a matter for which they don't comment on and is a matter for the local authority to decide. The two maps presented, the bottom map is the traditional flood risk map available on the Environment Agency's website. The top map is mapping information available from the Environment Agency, which goes into another level of depth, demonstrating where measurements have been taken in relation to topography. That's known as the annual exceedance probability map. To give you an example, a 2% exceedance probability rainfall event has a 2% chance of occurring in a year, so once every 50 years. In terms of how we consider safe access and egress from a site, what we're looking to achieve is a method of getting out of a flood zone into an area of flood zone 1, which is the lowest possible chance of flood risk. A safe access and egress route should allow occupants to enter and exit buildings and reach land within flood zone 1 using public rights of way without the intervention of emergency services. The council should seek to ensure developments are not permitted on dry islands. In all cases, a dry access or egress route is a route located above the 1% annual probability flood level, which is the 1 in 100 year, including an allowance for climate change. The Environment Agency have confirmed the access route across the site is above the 1 in 100 plus 70% climate change event, and therefore is considered dry. Officers are therefore satisfied that a dry route could be achieved. The EA have noted that the adjoining road to the access route from the site is located within the flood zone 3, 1 in 100 year. So that's referring to French and Vale itself. The submitted flood risk assessment shows that there's no risk to the site of the connection between the access from the site and the road, but it does acknowledge there is a risk of flooding to the east and west of the road for the 1 in 100 year flood zone 3 plus 35% climate change. The flood risk assessment notes that the road falls from west to east, which is consistent with the difference in flood levels of different nodes of the previous map as I was showing. The flooding is largely localised along this road, and owing to the topographical information, it's likely that flooding would be below the 300 millimetres, which would have a very low hazard rating. The hazard rating would be low and would not cause harm to people, and therefore in accordance with the guidance of Waverley's strategic flood risk assessment. Prior to this committee, neighbour representation was circulated to members, which showed French and Vale following the storm Dennis at the weekend on the 16th of February. The pictures on this slide show French and Vale on the morning of the 17th of February. We can see that the gullies at the side of the road are quite high, and that there is evidence that there has there has been some flooding across the road. The conclusion should not be drawn as to whether or not the road floods. No one is challenging that. The debate is whether or not safe access to and from the site can be achieved. On the previous application, there stood one reason for refusal, and that was going back to the beginning when part of the site was considered to be in flood zone 3, which triggered the requirement for a sequential test and potentially an exception test. The applicant has demonstrated in their flood risk assessment that the site is no longer located within flood zone 3, and therefore the test and the built form remains in flood zone 1. The test therefore comes down to the local authority to determine whether safe access or egress can be reached to the site. For this reason, officers consider that the key consideration should be whether or not flood risk. Officers consider that the key consideration for this application is whether or not safe access and egress can be achieved. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Zed. Now, I understand I've got 3 speakers tonight. Just to say that you have 4 minutes each speaker, and we do stick to that. You will get a warning 30 seconds before the time is up. So could I call on Mr. David Johnson, who I understand is objecting to this?
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, councillors. By way of introduction, my name is David Johnston. I've lived in Frensham Vale at number 33 since 1987. I'm grateful for the opportunity to express my own views, but I'm also representing those of the 250 or so members of our local community from our Residents Association who are having to deal with a blizzard of planning applications in relation to this property. The reason why residents are so exercised by this proposal is that Springfield, 30 Frensham Vale, is such a prominent site along the Vale. Sadly, the activity on the site has already damaged the character of that part of the road, but that is no reason to allow even more harm to our beautiful and precious environment. I have 2 key messages for committee members. Firstly, what was the point of the democratic, community-based process by which the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan has been prepared if we're not going to back it? The purpose of defining a built-up area boundary is to set an explicit boundary. To step outside it in one location sets a precedent for stepping outside it in anywhere else. The Neighbourhood Plan Review was the legitimate process for Farnham plans, which, as you know, residents have highlighted in great detail throughout their objections. Unfortunately, time does not allow me to repeat them here. Secondly, I have to highlight the problem of flooding. This is a very personal issue for me, as although my property is not within the floodplain, I suffer along with all other residents when the road floods, as we saw most recently during storms Kira and Dennis. On these occasions, the road was simply impassable and presented a real hazard. There is no safe passage, as it is not possible to make out the extent of the roadway from the Frensham Vale stream, which is part of the River Way system, which runs along the side of the road. And I hope you've had an opportunity to see the dramatic photographs which residents have taken. Unfortunately, there's been a great deal of confusion and misinformation around flooding and its impact on 30 Frensham Vale. To cut to the chase, I need to make the definitive position very clear. Bear in mind that with the onslaught of planning applications along the Vale, the Environment Agency have spent a good deal of time and effort in refining their information. The definitive position is that the highest risk flood zone runs right across the site at 30 Frensham Vale. This reflects the natural flow of water down into and along Frensham Vale and eastwards over to Latchwood Lane. I accept that the proposed property itself sits outside of flood zone 3. However, the driveway to access the property from Frensham Vale runs right across and through the functional floodplain, in other words, flood zone 3B. There is simply no way to access the proposed property without passing through flood zone 3B. You will all understand better than I do that the implication of this is that it's necessary in these cases to conduct sequential and exception tests, as well as demonstrating safe access and egress. None of these have been provided. Sadly, the information provided by the applicant in their flood risk assessment is incorrect. Following the storms of recent weeks and their devastating impact across the country, this has become a topical issue. And only this weekend, the Environment Secretary has said we mustn't compound the risk by building on floodplains. Thank you for your attention. I urge you to reject this proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Chair.
Can I now call on the second speaker, please, Mr. Andy Johnson, who is going to speak for 4 minutes on support of the application.
Good evening. My name's Andy Johnson. I'm a chartered civil engineer and I have 15 years of experience with flood risk and drainage design. I'm also a consultant to several councils where I review planning applications for flooding and drainage. I just wanted to summarise the flood information that's been quite well presented by Chris Turner this evening. In saying there is a lot of varied and conflicting information relating to flood risk on the scheme, and it's quite important to remember that the latest revision of the flood risk assessment that was submitted, which is version 5, contains the most accurate and current data available for the site and should supersede previous revisions of data and ground level information. To summarise, there are two real distinct flood models that have been supplied to us. The first is the model of flooding that enters through the centre of the site from west to east, which I believe is incorrectly noted as flood zone 3B, but it's part of the Frensham Vale flood study that was completed in 2012. This model has a varying flood level due to the slope of the area from west to east. And as part of the assessment of flood risk, we accurately plotted this flood data against the topographical survey information and demonstrated that the site in question, plot 3, was totally outside of any areas of flood risk. The latest revision of the report also indicates the relocation of the existing driveway ensures that the access from plot 3 to Frensham Vale itself is entirely outside of any flood risk zone. So because of this, we are able to demonstrate that the safe route of escape was achievable to Frensham Vale, which is an A road and therefore fully compliant with national planning policy. The second model to consider is the Frensham Vale 2018 model, which I believe was shown on the screen, which indicates that there's no flooding within the red line boundary of the site, or indeed any of that plot of Frensham Vale or the road in front of it. The flooding really occurs to the east and to the west. So we demonstrated with a simple assessment of that flood model that the site was fully compliant again with NPPF. It should be noted that should we be required to demonstrate further that safe route of escape is achievable to the east or to the west, this could be easily done with an assessment of the Environment Agency ground level data and the flood data. The information we have demonstrates that there is some flooding on there as the mapping shows, but the depth is not significant and it would certainly be considered a low or medium hazard, and it would not provide any additional load on emergency services. I would like to note that the current version of the flood risk assessment has gained technical approval from the Environment Agency and approval in principle from the Council, and so the objection on the basis of flood risk is not really valid. Photographs have been provided to the Council for the recent flooding with Storm Dennis. These are quite consistent with the second model, the 2018 flood model, that shows the water to the east and the west of the site, but not directly in front of it. Finally, I'd like to note that members should be aware that the council have already determined a similar scheme for the dwelling on the site, following liaison with ward members, and the previous scheme was refused only due to the small element of driveway encroaching on the flood risk zone, which has now been corrected.
Thank you, Mr Johnson.
Thank you.
If I could now call on the third speaker, please, which is Councillor Jerry Hyman. And Councillor, can I remind you, same rules, I'm afraid, 4 minutes, please. You'll get the 30-second warning.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, the agenda papers here report that the main concerns are the risk of flooding, harmful impact on the countryside, and due to infilling, fragmentation, overdevelopment and garden grabbing, and impacts on wildlife or habitats. Now, having rerouted the access road to overcome the flood risk to the LLFA and DA's satisfaction, the report concentrates 2 pages. The officer report concentrates 2 pages of its consideration of the impact on countryside. That's pages 19 and 20 of your officer reports, which I hope everybody's read. Officers rely on the 2 recent appeal decisions at Bramwell House and Reeve House, which were, quote, very similar in their considerations. That's what officers say in this report, that they were very similar considerations. It says that on page 19, in order to justify the recommendation to grant consent that's before you, members. In both cases, the inspector concluded the proposals for single dwellings in countryside beyond the Greenbelt would not harm the character and appearance of the area, thus setting precedents in overcoming the constraints of design and landscape RE1, TD1, FMP 10 and 11 and D1 and D4. However, despite the reliance on those appeals, the officer report fails to include the appeal decision notices. It's very important. It's happened before. And it fails to properly explain that both appeals have been dismissed by the inspector due to failure to comply with the habitats legislation. And that this application does exactly the same thing that the inspector there said absolutely correctly, he couldn't have said it otherwise, was contrary to the legislation. And that was the reason he had to. It wasn't a matter of choice. He had to comply with the legislation and refuse those. So the recommendation in front of you relies on appeal decisions which actually were dismissed for reasons that apply to this. That's very important. The inspector used common wording in his reason for dismissal in both appeals decisions, stating, and I quote, "I'm unable to conclude that the appeal would not, in combination with other developments, adversely affect priority species within the Waverley Spa. I cannot be confident the proposal would not adversely affect the integrity of this protected site and therefore cannot therefore fulfil the duty placed upon me as the competent authority under Regulation 63, and therefore the appeal must fail." Now, the reason that I'm here tonight is because my research last night found that Reeve House, one of those 2, was granted 13 days ago, on the 12th of February, after the applicant and officers had obviously worked together to resubmit the same application with a pretense of an appropriate assessment and grant it consent, which is scandalous as far as I'm concerned, and I think you should think that too. Very, very disappointing. There was, as you know, the Sweetman People Over Wind decision is being completely flouted by this council. It is the one thing upon which this must be refused. There are other issues. There's the 195-metre drag distance for bins. There is the issue of flood risk, of course. And inadequate amenity for occupiers because of the impact of 3 houses on a single plot. But it's very important for you to realise that the inspector had overturned precisely the wording in the officer report for Reeve House. It used exactly the same wording as you've got here on page 21, the top of page 21 of your officer report, which says that due to the availability of alternative recreational opportunities which would divert residents from use of the spa, the proposal would not have likely effect. You can't just assume that without an assessment. That's effectively saying mitigation exists, and you can't assume that without an assessment that proves it. And the inspector had recognised that at the Bramwell House and Reeve House appeals and had said that that's no good. So I would ask, please, that you either refuse consent or defer for a site visit and a proper appropriate assessment. Thank you very much indeed, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillors, over to you. Does anybody wish to ask a question? Councillor Clark. Sorry, Councillor Evans. I was very close.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 3 questions. The first is on page 17. As regards the size of the bedrooms, the table doesn't appear to be logical to me, because for bedroom 4, you've got a standard of 11.5, proposed 11.6, which shows a minus 0.9 difference. Am I reading the figures correctly?
An officer like to answer that?
Oh yeah, thank you. Yes, I think that was a typo in the difference between the standard and the proposed. The standard bedroom size for twin bedroom, according to the space standards, of which you know we don't have an adopted policy for, is 11.5 square metres.
Sorry, so the proposed is greater?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
So it should be plus?
It should be plus 0.1. I'm not sure why. I'm not too sure how that's happened.
So can I take it confidently that all the other figures in that table are correct?
Yes, I believe them to be, yes.
Okay, that was the first question. The second question is relating to the preemptive felling. That is of extreme concern when we're supposed to have a climate emergency and we're now felling trees in order to make a development. I mean, to me, that looks incompatible with a climate emergency. Where Surrey, Waverley are trying to plant trees, we're now cutting down trees in order to have a development. The third and final point is, does the bins have to be dragged 195 metres in order to be collected? If that is the case, this dwelling is reserved for somebody, for a family that's able-bodied. It excludes the elderly and excludes the disabled.
Did an officer want to respond to that?
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, so to start with the last point on the waste and recycling.
Sure.
Yes, that is a 195 metre or so drag distance. As in the officer's report, the waste and recycling team did raise objection to that, but we didn't feel that that was reason enough to refuse the application based solely on that drag distance.
Thank you.
And sorry, the point before that? Oh, it
was merely an observation that when the government, everyone is now talking about planting trees, we're now demolishing trees in order that the development can take place.
Yeah, I don't think that's a question, is it? It's a statement, thank you very much.
Okay. It's a statement.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Coburn?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I know we're not supposed to bring any emotion whatsoever into this and just do it in a very hard way, but quite frankly, those photographs broke my heart. They really, really did. I hadn't seen those photographs, obviously, until they were put up. I can remember driving my daughter up to this big house. The family were renting it for a short time. And I remember driving up, and Springfield, there's a bit of a clue in the name, isn't there? Springfield was a lake. I mean, you drove up the side of a very flooded field. Now, I know there's been some works, but the whole point of that, setting that building back and having that spring field, the floodplain in front, had a purpose. And it was to protect other houses as well, obviously, as that house. And, for a long time, I thought it was a lake rather than a flooded field as such, because it was always there every time you passed the house. when you drove past it in more recent times, it was just green. I mean, you didn't notice the entrance to that house at all, you know. You drove past a green boundary, and then there was the entrance to going up the side. I really could weep when I see what they've done. The amount of tarmac that is already down there to achieve what they want to achieve on this site, without any permission as such at the moment. Councillor Edmonds has already mentioned the trees. You know, I just wonder what we are doing on this site. I really do. We're told, because you do a little kink in the path, you're now safe from flooding. I've just driven back from Scotland, and either side up every road, there were flooded fields. Now, that wasn't particularly the worst it had been. And we do know that things are going to get worse. So what are they going to do? Move the path a little bit further when it goes another 6 inches? To me, it makes no sense whatsoever to accept something which is so marginal at a time when we have got all sorts of things going on, especially with flooding and rainfall. But there was something in one of the statements about the built-up area boundary and why it had been put where it had been put. It's a very simple thing. What the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan did was put the built-up area boundary more or less on the outline of the countryside beyond the green belt, when that actually carried some weight. The only exception to that was where we made it link up with actual curtilage lines rather than go through somebody's garden. So the built-up area boundary, countryside beyond the green belt, there is no difference as far as we're concerned as to what we're trying to achieve on that site, and by using policies like the old BE3, which is now FNP8, we're trying to conserve the greenery. We're trying to protect, as Councillor Edmonds says, the trees in certain areas of the town. You know, we've spent years doing this neighbourhood plan, years trying to work out where's the correct place for housing. And you've only got to look at the history on this site to see the determination. And I take my hat off to the residents for, fighting on and fighting for what they believe in, whether or not it's correct in planning terms. You know, to have that much love for where you live and the desire to protect it, I think is certainly worthy of praise. So I am completely conflicted on this. I'm completely conflicted. Half of me says one thing and the other half says absolutely not. And I'll wait and hear what other people have to say before I make a final decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. In that case, Councillor Hunt, I think you were next.
Yeah, thank you. So just in terms of the size of the bedrooms, just a point, I think actually all of the calculations in that table are wrong, from the standard to the proposed, looking through the difference. Those sums for the difference, I don't think any of those are correct. But my question is, I'm a bit confused in terms of the actual flood risk to this site. Listening to the public speaker and reading the details in the report, it seemed as though there were two different kind of calculations or standards over the last couple of years, 2018 versus now, as to what the actual flood risk was. So I'm not entirely clear on exactly, clearly what the flood risk is for this site. If somebody could clarify in simple terms for me to understand, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Councillor. 2 questions there then. The table, whether it's correct or not, and of course whether the floodplain, you accept both or whatever you accept as the correct.
Thank you, Chair. In relation to the table, I'm not quite sure why the difference part at the end is incorrect, because they were all measured individually, and I don't know if that's the symptom of doing it on an Excel sheet or something. I'm not too sure. So I do apologise for that. In relation to the 2 different types of modelling, I'm not a hydrologist. What I have been informed through the lead local flood authority and the Environment Agency is that applicant, through their flood risk assessment, has considered both models, which were, I think at the end of 2018 there was further modelling which took place on the River Way. So there was a minor update. I think on the back of residents' putting in representations directly to the Environment Agency that the applicants were told that they also had to consider a previous set of modelling. So as far as I understand it, and as much as I can explain it, both sets have been considered by the applicant. They have in their flood risk assessment demonstrated why they think it's safe and why they're satisfied the site wouldn't flood. And we have consulted the lead local flood authority, who, I should have done it at the beginning, provided an additional condition, which is on the update sheet, and raised no objection. And the Environment Agency, as I said previously, didn't raise objection. So in terms of that modelling, unfortunately, that is the best answer that I can give you as someone who is not a qualified hydrologist or civil engineer. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. 2 points. Somebody mentioned earlier, excuse me, I can't remember whether it was flooded zone 1, 2 or 3, but they were talking about 1 in 100 risk. I'm sure the residents of Frensham Vale will be very pleased to realise there won't be any more flooding for 99 years. But the serious point really I'd like to make is that there was a late consultee appearing on the website on the 14th of February, who was Mike Birch, the Senior Resilience Officer, Flood Risk Assessment Management and Programming of Surrey County Council. And basically he was saying that the current plans do not satisfy the SUDS hierarchy and is not compliant with NPPF and the accompanying PPG, whatever they are. I know the first one. It is necessary to ensure that the development does not increase the flood risk elsewhere. There are several houses, I believe, that are already suffering from runoff from the new driveway. But he does say that no permission should be allowed since building on this site would increase the flooding elsewhere. And that another point he made was that the exception and sequential test should be applied at the site before going any further. So I'm inclined not to support this application until that has been done. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. I'd like to ask the officer if they've got any knowledge of this particular quote and whether, in fact, it does hold water.
Apologies. Are you referring to the lead local flood authority comment from Mike Birch that was uploaded to the website? Yeah. Which suggests a condition and provides a reason. So that comment provides a condition and a reason as to why that condition should be attached.
Yeah, but should we not be applying this test before we consider the application?
What, do you mean the condition?
No, the sequential testing.
No, sorry. So the sequential test is applied when developments proposed within flood zones, within flood zone 2 and 3. Now, on the previous application, the access running across the site was we were unsure about its suitability in terms of whether that was within. So we accepted that the house was in flood zone 1, but that the access was in 2 and 3 possibly. So in that scenario, the NPPF requires us that we determine whether development is sequentially preferable to drive development away from areas of high risk of flooding. Now, on this latest application, through the amendments that they've made in their flood risk assessment and in the proposals to the driveway, it takes it out of that area and therefore there isn't a requirement to conduct the sequential test. So I appreciate, as Carol Colburn said, it's a marginal change, but in planning policy terms, that is sufficient for us not to require that additional level of information. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm not sure, but can we have a legal? I've not had this situation. We get a website come up. Perhaps you can advise, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Not so much as advice, but I'm just having a look through the representation here. I can't see anything in here where the officer from Surrey County Council suggests that a sequential test should be carried out, or actually anything else that the councillor suggested was in there. So possibly we're either not looking at the same representation, or there is some confusion on what we are supposed to be looking at here. We're looking at, just to be clear, an email dated 13th of February from Mike Birch from Surrey County Council. And it's an email in which the officer suggests that a condition be attached to the planning permission, which is what the officer is recommending we do.
Thank you. Councillor Martin, you were next. Okay, Councillor Coburn.
Well, I was just going to back up what Councillor Clark had said. It's not the sequential test, it's the mitigation that they have not submitted any mitigation. I mean, we as a local plan authority, we have to make sure that the access, that's our responsibility, isn't it? A safe access and egress, that has to be our decision. For the lifetime of this development, and we don't know how long this new house is going to last, can we say there will be a safe access? And at the moment, we have no mitigation to show how they're going to improve matters if there is a consequence of what they're doing. So we were saying we should have the mitigation first before we make the decision on whether or not there's going to be an adverse effect on other properties or on the access and egress, surely. That's what he's saying, not the sequential test.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any more questions?
Just to come back to Councillor Coburn's point.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry,
go on.
Sorry, officer, yeah. We need one microphone off. Councillor Bishop, can you turn yours off then?
Just to be clear, because of the nature of the access and where it sits, no requirement for mitigation has been identified. So no absolute harm has been identified that would require mitigation. So it's not required as an outcome of the planning application. That's my understanding, because no harm has been identified, because it sits outside the flood zone. So no mitigation. You can't require mitigation if it's not identified as harm. That's my understanding. Is that correct?
Yeah, thanks, Pastor. Yeah, as far as I understand it, the condition was recommended by the lead local flood authority following our consultation with them. Normally, for a minor development like this, we wouldn't actually consult them. And as I say, within the update sheet, we have attached that condition to ensure that that is complied with prior to the development of the actual house itself.
Any other officer? If not, Councillor Blishen, you were.
Thank you, Chair. We'll just read out my notes so as not to waste too much time. The erection of this dwelling is not in line with the Farnham Design Statement and Neighbourhood Plan Policy FNP 1A, D, E, F, G. FNP 10 and being outside the built-up area boundary. The subdivision of larger plots is unacceptable as it has a detrimental effect on the characteristics of the semi-rural area. The front of the site is in flood zone 3. I've got a whole list of objections. Do you want to hear them? I suppose you do. The development site is classified flood zone 3B, functional floodplain, and should not be considered for housing purposes. The FRA submitted by the applicant is not accurate. It is not a flood zone 1 as is confirmed by the EA flood map. EA letter from Jonathan Fleming, information supplied by Dr Paul Garrard and Waverley flood map, and as such an exception and sequential test is required. No exception or sequential test information has been provided. There is no safe escape route, FD 2320. It is the intention of the owners to open up the old driveway to serve the main house only, in contravention of their Certificate of Lawfulness WA 2017-1825. This will render the new driveway unlawful, therefore there will be no access to the proposed house. The development site sits within an area designated as countryside beyond the green belt. The development sits within an area designated as outside the built-up area boundary. The neighbourhood plan does not include development of this site. The neighbourhood plan has required number of sites to fulfil its obligation within the local plan. The development will impair the habitat for many species within Wildlife Corridor 04. The site falls within buffer zones of the Wealden Heaths and Thames Basins SPA's reference European Court of Justice ruling case C 323/17, People over Wind and Sweetman 2018, relating to the Habitats Directive. Garden grabbing and goes against NPF guidelines and Waverley planning recommendations. The site does not appear on the Waverley Brownfield Land Register. And last but not least, we seem to have forgotten about climate change here, which has turned things right on its head. Thank you.
Councillor Hunt.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Just kind of one point really, or 2 points. The preemptive felling of woodland has been mentioned already, is concerning. I mean, presumably preemptive felling of the woodland would be on the assumption that this would be approved. I mean, that's what I understand preemptive to mean. But and also the thing with the bins, it says that they're going to have to drag the bins 195 metres to the road, which is ridiculous. I mean, it is. In the rain, 195 metres to take the bins out to the front of the road. That's what it says in the document. It says the other house, the existing dwelling, also is above the maximum kind of designated limit, but it didn't say how much. So maybe it's 35 metres or whatever, but nearly 200 metres. I mean, come on. I wouldn't want to live there.
Thank you. Is there an officer who would like to comment on the first of those questions?
Yeah, can I come back to some of the comments that Councillor Blisham made? I just want to go back to some of these photographs and go back to the previous application, which, as I explained at the beginning, this is a resubmission of that previous application. Now, on that previous application, there was one reason for refusal, which related to flood risk. There was no reason for refusal relating to landscaping or visual impact to the surrounding area. And I would just like to make the point as to why that was, in terms of looking at the photographs, in particular numbers 11 and 12 here, which show that the proposal itself would be the proposal would have extremely limited visibility from the surrounding area. And for that was the reason why we, in determining the previous application, didn't apply any sort of landscaping harm. Now, members should be aware of the fact that there were two other properties proposed towards the front of the site. If I go back to one, in photograph 3, there was a property proposed there, and in photograph 4, there was a property proposed there. Now, in both situations of those applications and in the appeal statements, those applications were refused on landscape harm, and we have defended and are in the process of defending both those applications on landscaping harm, because those applications would be visible from French and Vale and have that urbanising impact. Now, in relation to this application, yes, it's in the countryside beyond the green belt. for which the impact on the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside has to be considered. Now, in coming to the recommendation on the report before you this evening, that was considered, and the fact included that as a, that is not some, that isn't something for which we consider there would be a substantial evidence or reason for refusal. Just on another point that you made in the objection in relation to the wildlife corridor, Surrey Wildlife Trust have been consulted on the application and have raised no objection to the scheme, but have recommended conditions to mitigate against any potential harm. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make those points. And then going back to the preemptive felling, we have no control prior to an application coming in as to what felling can take place across a site. These weren't protected trees in terms of they're not protected by a TPO or a group TPO, although the trees off to the rear are in this particular instance. And just to make clear, the group TPO along the front, which is pictured, let's spin this one. Sorry, just trying to find the best picture. Sorry, I don't have a great picture in this instance, but the TPO woodland at the front, it isn't proposed of any further felling or thinning takes place to that group TPO. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Now, I have two more councillors. Can I just take Councillor Merrill's first, because she hasn't spoken yet?
Thank you, Chair. What depresses me about this is that the officers who live in the same world as we do must be aware that climate change is a major thing going on here. Sustainable development, if you look it up, sustainable says without depletion of natural resources. And the natural resources are our wildlife, our biodiversity, our land left free to absorb water where it's needed. And I'm not sure, and I agree with Councillor Coburn about this, is that you can move your driveway a little bit more and a little bit more, but we don't know what's ahead of us. We're at the tipping edge at the moment with climate change. So I don't feel that that is going to be something that we can contain. We don't actually know what's going to happen. This is a very flooded area. The character of this road has this rather large, rather beautiful houses set back, and it's something we should be preserving. It's not something we should be going, oh, well, actually, it's okay. It's not really, causing a problem. But that's part of our design statement. And I feel with officers, you put far too much emphasis on the development, not on the sustainability or our design statements. And I think this is becoming a problem for all of us. I agree with Mr. Hyman as well. There hasn't been a proper assessment. There should be a much better assessment. And when you see some of the things that Surrey Wildlife said, we've had this before, oh, if you see a reptile, you'll have to stop working. We know that's not going to happen. So for me, I will not be voting this through. I don't think it's appropriate in any way. It doesn't respect our Farnham design statement. It doesn't respect those people who've done our neighbourhood plan. And that is what we have to that is what we have. And that's what we have. That's what a lot of work has gone into in order to preserve the nature and character of this area. But not only that, we are now in a very different world where the climate is really extraordinary. Things are going to happen that we don't know that we can cope with, and that really, the emphasis on that, on looking after our land, is very important now. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe an officer wishes to speak.
Thank you, Chairman. Just one point that I want to try and remind members that is material to your consideration tonight, that we have issued a decision in the past on this site with a reason for refusal. and the focus should, in terms of being consistent, should be on whether that has been overcome or not. I know a kind of a wide range of comments have come forward, but in terms of kind of making sure we're consistent in our decision making and being reasonable in that respect, I would suggest that actually the focus should be on whether that reason has been overcome. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Murley, for reminding us where policy may need to go, but I would remind members that the officer report has considered the policies that are in front of us today, and those are the policies that the officers can only and should only refer to, and those are the policies that I would ask and remind members that they should refer to and consider in the determination of this application. We all have a view on where the climate is going in the future, but climate emergency has been declared, but the policies haven't quite caught up with it. So I just remind you that we can only make decisions with the policies that we have in front of us today. The officer's report has set that out. A planning balance consideration has been set out. If you wish to make a variation to that, I would suggest you take on board what Chris has already said about we have considered this application and taken that into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Coburn.
Yes, I've got a question after this about the original driveway. I do want clarification on that, because my issue with this is, and I'm following on from Councillor Murley's, I mean, we are in total agreement here, even if we use slightly different words. The fact that we have got so much tarmac now on what was originally the floodplain is automatically going to send water in another direction. It doesn't matter whether we're talking 20 years hence or today. We have got now on what was once a green site, the pictures have gone, can we have the pictures back? Because it's the amount of tarmac that's gone across a floodplain is automatically going to spread water onto adjacent properties. It has to, it's got to go somewhere, and it used to get absorbed in that bit with a bit of luck. And, you know, the urbanising effect of, which we're not supposed to mention, you know, is already in place because of the amount of tarmac that we've now got here. And tarmac is of no use to man nor beast, as we know. I mean, it gets your car to your house, but I mean, in terms of biodiversity or the atmosphere and anything that's helpful to people, it contributes nothing. So, you know, my biggest problem is still, looking at it purely from the flooding point of view, I cannot see that this amount of tarmac and a tiny blip to go around what is an existing flood pattern is remotely enough consideration, enough comfort for us to say that this is acceptable in flooding terms. I still find it very, very difficult to believe that, given the change to the site, given that, you know, things are moving all the time at the moment with storms, that we can guarantee that there will not be flooding for the lifetime of this development, which is what we are supposed to do as an authority.
Thank you. Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Chairman. I wasn't actually going to speak, and then a couple of things have sort of occurred to me. I wasn't over in agreement with the officer's inference that because we have given permission before to something here that we are therefore duty-bound to carry on doing so. I would submit that if we made one bad decision, we shouldn't therefore say we should continue making bad decisions. We should view everything as we are constantly told on its individual merit. Secondly, I've just been past a whole load of photographs of the roads that you popped up earlier, which appear to be well underwater, which one of my colleagues tells me you agreed to demonstrate to the meeting, and I haven't seen them. Is there a reason for that?
So, sorry, in reference to the photographs, they were a neighbour representation, which was received and should be on the website. I was under the impression, given that I was handed a paper copy by the committee members which made the trip to the site visit, that those had made their way around, you know, each and every member of the committee. So Yeah, that is a reason why they've not, why I didn't personally circulate them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Now, we need to draw this to a conclusion. I've got Councillor Edmonds. Are you raising a new point?
Yes, sorry, a legal question. Doesn't the Planning Act 2008 require us to consider climate change mitigation?
Kim?
I think I'd need a few minutes to answer that, but my initial comments would be that although we don't have a local plan policy specifically dealing with it, there is, I am aware of some recent cases where certain climate change reasons have been found to be material to planning decision making. So certainly these issues can be relevant, but it depends on the circumstances of the case, and these are issues of fact and degree, as they often are. So in this case, we are limited to a fairly technical issue, and I would just remind members that we have advice from our technical consultants, and as far as I can tell, that advice is fairly clear, and I can't personally see that there is a case here to suggest that any climate change issues relating to the felling of trees, for instance, is so sufficient or so relevant that it should be material to your determination of the application. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hyman. Councillor Hyman, I am told you can come back only for clarification and a short point. Did you want to make any clarification?
Thank you very much. Yes, only that the issue here, reality from the appeal decisions which have been relied upon by the officers is the question that remains is there an appropriate assessment containing bird and population numbers? So it has to be a risk assessment containing the bird population numbers and the efficacy of the mitigation, i.e. the efficacy of whether the existence of other land, which as it says in the officer report, its mere existence is sufficient, because obviously if that was true, then there would be no Weldon Heaths policy, there would have been no moratorium last year, there would have been no Sweetman judgment. So the question here is whether or not there is an appropriate assessment, and there isn't. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. Is an officer prepared to answer that, or?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. As far as I am aware, this application site lies within the Weldon Heaths buffer zone and also the Thames Basin Heath 7-kilometre buffer zone. The avoidance strategy for Thames Basin Heaths doesn't, I believe, require automatic mitigation for schemes within the 7K in the same way as it does for schemes that are within the 5K buffer zone. So we are in a situation where the local authority has to assess whether it thinks this scheme being proposed is likely to have significant effects on those two spars. Now, given the responses from Natural England, which are that it won't, and given the fact that we do have an appropriate assessment, a strategic appropriate assessment for the local plan, which comments on each of those spars and the pressures that they are each under, I think it's perfectly reasonable for officers to conclude that this scheme is unlikely to have significant effects on those two spars. Therefore, it's not necessary to go to the appropriate assessment stage. And because there is no mitigation required, it doesn't trigger the Sweetman case in the sense that there is no need to assess that for that reason. So I'm happy from a legal point of view that one isn't necessary. Thank you.
Thank you,
Chairman, you were very, very kind. But can I just please say that the whole point of the legal justice is you can't make those conclusions without an assessment.
I'm sorry, we can't have a debate.
That's the whole
It was for
point.
clarification. You asked the question, and it has been clarified. Thank you. Now, I did say we weren't having more questions. However, I have two. So, Councillor Clark, would you like to... You raise your hand.
Thank you, Chairman. I was going to ask the exact same question that Councillor Hyman asked, but we appear to have had an answer.
Thank you. Councillor Coburn, this is the final question, please, and it is new.
It'll be very quick. We have a climate change policy, CC4, in our local plan, and it says that development will only be permitted where it can be demonstrated that it would not constrain the natural function of the floodplain either by impeding flood flow or reducing storage capacity. And my point is that this application, because of the amount of tarmac already across the floodplain, flood zone 3, does do that. It actually, whatever the word is, reduces the storage capacity.
Thank you, Councillor Coburn. In that case, we need to move on to the vote. Now, we have a recommendation. The permission is recommended for approval subject to conditions 1 to 12 of the committee report and amended condition 7 and additional condition 13 of the update sheet. Are we all perfectly clear on that? If we are, can I have all those in favour with a hand rising, please?
No, we can't.
Sorry, it appears we can't do electronic voting
So
tonight. So, those against?
Those four. Those against. That's 9 against.
I do apologise. Got carried away with my own power.
So yeah, vote.
Now, that means the motion is lost. Now we need to put our reason why we are against it, and then we vote on that. Now, it has to be obviously legal and what we were talking about. So can an officer perhaps help us with the reason we have objected it, which I think Councillor Coburn seems to have got most of it about the flood. Councillor Coburn, would you like to...
Yes, I mean, I would obviously suggest that this application be refused, and I don't think the mitigation measures, are enough to guarantee that this site. See Patrick there working this out. Yes, I know what you're going to say, but you can come up with much better words. But we, as a local planning authority, are supposed to build in some form of guarantee for the lifetime of a development. And I am suggesting that because the amount of change to this application, it hasn't overcome the natural changes that there will be in the future, and it does not carry out completely our policy CC4 in terms of not reducing the storage capacity of the area.
Thank you. Councillor Edmonds, I believe you might have something to add to that.
Yeah, yes, sure. This development has many of the disadvantages of being beyond the built-up boundary area. And for me, the most irrational situation is that a waste bin should be dragged 195 metres. I could never, under any circumstances, sustain that as a recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Edmonds. Now, I will ask the officers if they can reword Councillor Coburn's point, which I think most of us agree with, into something that would be legally defined. Thank you. I'll give you 2 minutes if you want. Is there any other councillor who wants to add? Councillor Coburn again.
Just going back to the report, Chairman, I think it's contrary to paragraph 155 of the MPPF, as well as contrary to our policy CC4.
My only caution against that is the technical advisors who've assessed it haven't technically concluded that, and I'm just conscious that we will have to defend any decision that we come up with, and that decision needs to be robust in its nature. So can we just have a minute? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Members, in light of the fact that we don't actually have a technical objection from the specialist authorities, I would really urge you to steer away from flooding reasons in and of themselves and perhaps look at what we can exercise judgment over in terms of safe access and egress to and from the site. Something along the lines that it hasn't been sufficiently demonstrated that that can be achieved and is therefore contrary to the relevant policies of the development plan. Thank you, Chairman.
That sounds eminently sensible to me. It's what we've been talking about. If I take that wording, can I have a proposer for it, please, from the councillors? Anybody willing to propose that? Have I a seconder, please? Thank you. So we have a new proposal. If I could ask you just to read it to clarify.
So what I would suggest is that it hasn't been sufficiently demonstrated that safe access and egress can be to and from the site can be achieved, and the proposal therefore conflicts with policy CC4 of the of Part 1 of the CC1 and CC4 of Part 1 of the Waverley Borough Local Plan 2018.
Thank you for that clarification. That is what we're going to vote on. So can I have all those in favour of that proposal, please?
Refusal.
Those against?
Abstentions.
Sorry, are you abstaining? And I'll see you all in about a month's time. Thank you. Or if not,